I'd been solo camping for years, and I thought I'd learned to read the woods. I knew what normal sounded like, what was just the forest being the forest, and what wasn't. This trip was supposed to be my last before the season turned. Early September, mild weather, no bugs, perfect conditions. I picked a spot on BLM land that I'd found on an old hiking forum. No amenities, no marked campsites, just forest. The hike in was quiet. Too quiet. I didn't see a single other person on the 4-mile trail in, and no fresh tracks or boot prints in the dirt. By late afternoon, I'd found a small clearing just big enough for my tent and a little fire ring. I dropped my pack and just stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. Usually you can hear birds calling this time of day, squirrels chattering, but here it was just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood. I set up camp, tent first, then the fire. Dinner was simple. A can of chili over the flames, a few slices of bread, coffee. I'd just poured the coffee into my metal mug when I heard it, a faint crunch from the tree line opposite me. It was deliberate, slow, like someone putting their foot down carefully, heel to toe, on dry pine needles. I turned my headlamp toward the sound, but the beam only caught the first few rows of trunks. Nothing moved. The steps stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe an elk, but it didn't feel like an animal. It felt patient, waiting for me to look away. By midnight, the fire was down to embers. I climbed into my tent, zipped the door, and lay back in my bag. I don't know how long I'd been asleep before I woke up to the sound again, that slow, deliberate crunch of pine needles. This time, it was closer, moving in a slow circle around the tent. I froze, barely breathing. My ears tracked each step, the way they'd stop for 10 or 15 seconds, then start again. It was too controlled to be random wildlife. My first instinct was to call out, but I stopped myself. If it was a person, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Instead, I eased the zipper down just enough to peek through the opening. I kept my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The lantern outside was still burning low, its light just barely touching the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw him. He was standing perfectly still at the far edge of the light, facing the tent, wearing a dark jacket, dark pants, and a beanie. No backpack, no visible gear, just standing there. I stayed frozen, eyes barely above the zipper line. He didn't move toward me, didn't speak, but he also didn't turn away. I slowly pulled the zipper closed again, my hands shaking. The steps didn't start again for another hour, at least by my guess. But when they did, they came from the opposite side of the tent. At one point, I heard the faint rustle of fabric, and a sound like something being dragged across the ground. Every time I thought he was gone, a twig would snap, or a patch of pine needles would crunch again, just far enough away that I couldn't see him. I stayed awake until the black of the sky turned that faint pre-dawn gray, my body rigid the entire time. When the light was strong enough to see, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it, my gear untouched, the fire pit cold. But in the dirt between the tent and the trees were boot prints. They came in from the forest, looped around the tent in a wide circle, and left the way they came. I didn't waste time. I packed fast, glancing up every few seconds toward the tree line. My stomach knotted when I noticed something else. A second set of prints, smaller than the first, coming in from a different direction and stopping just short of the clearing. The hike out was the longest 4 miles I've ever walked. I kept expecting to hear those same slow steps behind me, but the forest was silent except for the wind. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors before I even took off my pack. I sat there for a long time, watching the empty trailhead in the rearview mirror. I still don't know what they wanted or why they never came closer, but I do know this. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, you don't need to be touched to be in danger. Sometimes all it takes is knowing. Someone's out there, watching you. It had been Zach's idea to hike out to one of the isolated campsites in the national forest. No hookups, no marked trails, just a spot on the map we'd found online, 4 miles in from the trailhead. We left the car just before noon. The forest still felt damp from days of off-and-on rain, the air thick with that rich smell of wet pine and earth. The hike in wasn't hard, but it was quiet, eerily quiet. We didn't pass anyone on the trail, no boot prints in the mud, except our own. By the time we reached the site, the sun was already low, filtering through the canopy in long, thin streaks. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground, a small fire ring made of stones, a little rise behind us for wind cover, and a creek about 30 yards away. We went through the routine without even talking about it. Tent staked, sleeping pads unrolled, gear hung from a low branch. I got a fire going while Zach filtered water from the creek. Dinner was a couple of dehydrated meals we'd both eaten 100 times, washed down with the cheap beer we'd hauled in. It was after we'd been sitting there for a while, the light fully gone, that Zach glanced up mid-conversation and froze. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 200 yards off, there was a second glow. Not the warm spread of a lantern, but the sharp, flickering light of a fire. We hadn't passed another soul on the way in. According to the map, the next closest marked site was nearly 2 miles away, in the opposite direction. We both just stared at it for a minute, not saying anything. In the middle of the forest, miles from anyone, a second fire you weren't expecting just didn't feel right. Curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed our headlamps and decided to take a quick walk, figuring we'd say hello and maybe share a beer. The forest at night feels different. Even with light, every shadow feels deeper, every sound sharper. We followed what looked like a game trail, winding through thickets and over fallen logs, the glow of the second fire shifting in and out of view. The closer we thought we were getting, the quieter we got. No voices, no laughter, just the steady flicker of that light ahead. We pushed through a patch of wet brush and stepped into a small clearing, but there was no camp, no tent, no people. The glow was still there though, now farther to our right. Zach muttered something under his breath, but neither of us said what we were both thinking. We'd been walking straight toward it for 15 minutes, and somehow it was still the same distance away. We stood there for a long moment listening. Somewhere deep in the trees, a branch snapped. Not the light pop of a squirrel, a heavy, deliberate break. Zach's light swept toward the sound, but the beam caught nothing. The firelight flickered again through the trees, and this time, I noticed there wasn't any smoke. I felt my stomach knot. Whoever was out there didn't want company, and we were a long way from anyone else. We turned back toward our own camp, keeping our lights on the ground to avoid catching the glare of eyes in the dark. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder. The glow was still there, steady and warm, like it hadn't moved an inch. When we got back, our fire had burned low. I added a couple of logs, and Zach quietly suggested we skip the second night and head back in the morning. I didn't argue. We didn't talk much after that. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening for footsteps, for voices, for anything. A couple of times I thought I heard faint movement out past the firelight, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or just my brain trying to fill the silence. When the first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, I unzipped the flap and stepped out into the cold. The forest looked the same as it always did in the morning, damp, quiet, harmless. I walked a short distance toward where we'd seen the other fire, just enough to glimpse that same clearing. The folding chair was still there. The sleeping bag was still there. But the fire pit was cold. Ash scattered, like it hadn't been touched in days. Whoever had been out there wasn't camping, they'd just been watching. We'd booked the site months in advance. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. Just me, my wife, and our 9-year-old daughter, 3 days at a state park we'd never been to before. We left home early Friday afternoon, the truck packed tight with gear and food. The weather was perfect, crisp, clear skies, just cool enough in the shade to make a campfire feel good. The drive into the park took us down a winding 2-lane road that eventually narrowed to gravel. The sites were spread far apart, with thick stands of trees between them for privacy. When we pulled into ours, site number 18, the first thing I noticed was that someone had left things behind. The picnic table had a blue cooler on it, lid half open. There were 2 folding chairs around the fire ring, one tipped on its side. The tent in the back corner of the site was partially collapsed, one side sagging like the poles had been pulled out. I figured maybe the previous campers had packed in a hurry and forgot a few things. My wife assumed a ranger had left it like that to deal with later. Still, it was odd. The cooler wasn't empty. I could see a couple of soda cans inside, along with a loaf of bread and what looked like a jar of peanut butter. My daughter asked if the site was really ours. I pulled up the confirmation email on my phone and showed her the site number. Yep, 18. This is it. But the whole place had that feeling, like we were walking into someone else's living room uninvited. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up. I moved the cooler to the side of the table, set our own next to it. My wife righted the tipped chair and used the other to prop her feet up while we unpacked. The tent in the back, we left it alone. By nightfall, the forest had settled into that deep stillness you only get far from the city. The occasional insect, the pop of wood in the fire, and our own quiet voices. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing toward that collapsed tent. There was something about it I didn't like. The way one side still seemed pegged into the ground. The way the zipper was halfway up, like someone had left it in a hurry. Around 10 p.m., after my daughter had gone to bed, my wife and I sat by the fire. That's when we both heard it. A single sharp crack from the trees, like a branch snapping underfoot. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam hit nothing but trunks and undergrowth. Probably a deer, my wife said, but she didn't sound convinced. About 20 minutes later, there was another sound. Not a snap this time, more like something brushing against fabric. I turned toward the tent in the back, but it looked exactly the same. The shadows from the fire made it hard to tell if anything had moved. We decided to call it a night, but I kept my knife clipped to the side pocket of my sleeping bag just in case. I woke up just before sunrise. My wife was still asleep, but something had pulled me out of a dream. That low hum of awareness you get when you're not alone. I unzipped the tent quietly and stepped into the cold morning air. The fire was out and the forest was dead silent. That's when I noticed the cooler. The lid was closed now. I hadn't touched it the night before. I walked over and flipped it open. The soda and bread were still there, but the peanut butter jar was gone. I looked toward the collapsed tent. In the soft dirt between it and the trees were fresh boot prints. I followed them a few steps into the tree line before they vanished into the undergrowth. We broke camp in record time. My wife didn't even ask why. She could see it on my face. On the way out, we stopped at the ranger station to let them know someone might have left gear behind at number 18. The ranger frowned and shook his head. That site's been closed all season, he said. We haven't issued a permit for it since last year. I didn't know what to say. We drove home in silence. I still think about those boot prints, the food in the cooler, and how, out there in the middle of the forest, it's impossible to know if the person who set up that tent ever actually left. The forest keeps its own secrets. Sometimes they're in the shadows beyond the firelight. Sometimes they're in the places you thought were empty. And sometimes they're standing just far enough away that you can't tell if they're coming closer or waiting for you to leave. This has been the Shadow Hour.